Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Well, as the Muslim world continues to feel the effects of this extraordinary awakening and series of protests that we've seen over the last few weeks and months, today we're going to turn our attention to the case of Iran. And I have the pleasure of being joined by a specialist of the country, Rouzbeh Parsi, who's a research fellow at the European Institute for Security Studies. Thanks ever so much for being with us. Now, of course, we've seen over the last few weeks, this fascinating story unfold, this fascinating wave of protests unfurl across the Muslim world. Tehran has also had its series of protests. Give us a taste of what's been going on there over the last few weeks.
Well, basically what's happened is that people in Iran, particularly the government, have been trying to take credit for what's been happening in Egypt, while the opposition has been taking getting some confidence back in being able to do something along the same lines. So both sides have been trying to bask in the glory of Egypt, in a sense.
To make the revolution their own. Of course, I suppose the case of the government is that Iran has had its own revolution.
Definitely. So in their case, it's a question of saying that 1979 was just a harbinger of what is coming now, and that basically the Egyptians are following the Iranian lead.
Of course, that is not the reading, presumably, of the Iranian opposition.
No. The Iranian opposition rather would perhaps see that what they did in 2009 is now happening in Egypt, but much more successfully so. And that in both cases, the end goal aspired to is the same, which is democratic reform. Is
there some sense in that argument that perhaps those extraordinary events that we saw in Tehran in 2009, those protests over the election, could they, in a sense, have been the beginning of what we've seen elsewhere? People taking to the streets against an autocratic regime, a very hard-line one that made protests difficult and opposition rare. In a sense, was that the first act of bravery that led to the ones we've seen elsewhere? Well,
we can say perhaps, I'm not quite sure. I mean, the Iranians would like to think that the Arabs are following their lead, but I think perhaps more in the medium, in the way, the mode of working, you can see comparisons. That is, Facebook, Twitter, all these kind of social communication means are similar. And the goals are similar in terms of leadership. You have the same thing. There is no clear leadership. It's more a question of young people being fed up with the situation. So in those things, you can say there is a comparison to be made.
What went wrong in 2009 from the point of view of the protesters? Why didn't it work?
Well, I think, in a sense, the paradox is that Iran is a much more nuanced political system. And so, therefore, you didn't get this kind of clear-cut situation where there is basically just the government and then there is the opposition. In the Iranian case, rather, it's a question of different nuances of the bureaucracy. They're not all on the same side. And people, because they had a meaningful election, they still sensed that they could try and aspire to reforms from within the system, rather than just to outright reject it.
To a certain extent, was one of the keys to the regime staying in place in Iran the fact that it never blinked in the way that of Mubarak or Ben Ali did? That is, concessions weren't given, that then, in a sense, encouraged the protesters.
Yes, particularly in the sense that those in power who've been, in a sense, fearing and scaremongering about this kind of opposition were prepared on how to deal with it. Because already in 1999 you had spontaneous demonstrations in Tehran by students for different reasons, but particularly due to the political deadlock. That one was, in a sense, put down because the reformists, who were, in a sense, on the same side as the students, backed down. This time everyone knew there was no backing down to be made, because this was an election for the presidency. This wasn't just a dispute over a newspaper as in 1999.
Now, they'd felt, you said, that it was still possible to change the system from within. Is that still the case within Iran's opposition? Is there still a sense that they can do that, or are they keeping a close eye on what's happening in the Arab world and intending to come back with a vengeance, in a sense?
Well, I think if stability of any kind, now that word has gotten some bad rep recently, but I mean, in a sense you can say that as long as the government does not make any concessions, if it does not manage to fully quench and kill off the opposition, which I think is highly unlikely that they will be able to do, that opposition is going to become more radical. Now, of course, the more radical they become, the less compromise they're willing to make. So in that sense, both sides are pushing each other to the brink, with the primary responsibility being on the side of the government, of course.
is it not then inevitable, given that the seeds of revolt were there and have been for a long time, given that the opposition is likely to feel emboldened by what's happening in the Arab world, that at some point, sooner or later, they will take back to the streets in greater numbers, and that the regime will be in danger, as the regimes in the Arab world have been over the last few weeks?
There are things that go in that direction, but there are also some countervailing forces. First of all, the Iranian government is not dependent on the population when it comes to the income with which it governs the country. It's the oil that, in a sense, defines what it can do and cannot do. So it can try and buy off, and is already trying to do that, and it can try and absorb some of these people without making any concessions on the political side. So that would be one avenue. Of course, the other problem is that if people go out into the streets and their demands are uncompromising as a reaction to the repression they've been suffering from, that also means that those who are in power know that there will be no political life left for them if the protesters succeed. In a sense, their back will be against the wall, which usually does not make people more willing to compromise, but rather they will try and fight it out, like in Libya.
They're fighting for their political life.
That will be their interpretation.
Now, of course, another significant difference must be the isolation of the Iranian regime. We saw in Egypt and in Tunisia regimes that, although despotic and unpopular with their own populations, had strong friendships and backers in the West.
Yeah.
That is not the case.
No.
In Iran.
I mean, the Iranian government isn't beholden to anyone, which means it's not going to be prone to listening to anyone from the outside, cautioning it in either direction, unfortunately.
Possibly quite the opposite. In a sense, do you think that the isolation might make it, in a sense, embolden the regime further?
Yes, I think you could say that they have nothing to lose in that regard. There is no particular international reputation that they care about enough to stay their hand. And in any case, there is also an ideological element here. I mean, both these groups consider themselves to be heirs of the revolution of 1979. So this is not just the question of who holds power. It's also, I think, for many on the side of the government, perhaps a sincere belief that they are the real heirs of the revolution. So in that sense, again, there's no reason to listen to anyone from the outside, because the whole point of that revolution was to be independent.
One of the other significant differences in Iran with Tunisia and, say, Egypt, and it's also a difference that we saw in the early days in Libya, although less so now that the regime is literally fighting for its life, and that the country is already fighting between a well-established opposition and the government forces, was the presence of journalists. So that you have in Tunisia and Egypt, the whole world was watching. Yeah. We were all there. And so, in a sense, the people in Tahrir Square in Cairo, for instance, knew that they were being watched by the entire world, and this gave them a certain strength that the protesters in Tehran simply don't have.
No, not anymore, and didn't have to the same degree to begin with, and definitely not today. So that is definitely a very important difference. I mean, in that sense, Tahrir Square was an operatic stage on which anyone could try and show off how many they were and what they wanted. And Mubarak's regime basically allowed that to happen for a very long time before realizing that it worked against them. In the case of Iran, they've been much quicker and much earlier on aware of the importance of media for their own survival. And again, you can say that also goes back to the fact that this is a revolutionary regime. So they, this is a playbook they used themselves to depose the Shah in 1979. And so obviously it's going to take a lot for them to forget those lessons and have them turned against themselves.
We saw it very clearly, of course, roughly the week when Hosni Mubarak fell in Egypt. We saw those pictures from Tehran of the celebrations of marking the anniversary of that revolution. What has, you've been watching very closely, what has changed in Ahmadinejad's language? What signs are there from the outside that the regime is weakening or strengthening? What are you reading into how he's responded to what was going on in the Arab world?
Well, obviously, for someone who's been banking on being able to circumvent the leaders of the Arab world and talk directly to their populations, which has been the way the Iranian governments, for basically ever since the revolution, have been trying to create friends in the region, where no one really wanted to have anything to do with them. This was triumphant for him. But at the same time, I think he's perfectly well aware of the fact that the groundswell that this was based on has the same kind of dynamics as the one that is opposing him at home. So they were trying to put a pretty face on a situation that they were surprised by just like everybody else.
And in what state is Iran's opposition today?
Well, in a sense, it's very difficult to judge because it never managed to coalesce into an organizational form that you could gauge. But it seems for the moment that it is migrating out of the country, particularly since the house arrest, or whatever you want to call it, of the leaders of this green opposition. More and more of the pronouncements and proclamations that we have come from the outside, by people who at least now seem to be less self-appointed and actually to be more like the representatives of this movement.
Very briefly, of course, many of these movements have been leaderless, and the chances are that if this happens in Iran, it will come from the people. What do you think is the likelihood that the people will dare to take the street again, like they did in 2009?
Well, I think the one lesson we can learn from this, which is basically the same one as every other revolution, is that it seems inconceivable before it happens, and then it seems very inevitable. So in that sense, that's very, very difficult to tell. I think the way the Iranian society is developing, the problems that are at the basics of this conflict are not going to go away. So even though the government seems to be very strong at the moment, it is actually becoming more brittle because it's alienating many of its own constituents.
Rouzbeh Parsi, thanks ever so much for having been with us on the interview today. That's all we've got time for on today's programme. We'll be back very soon for another interview here on France 24. Do stay with us.